The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway hummed faintly above me, a sterile rhythm that clashed with the heaviness in my chest. I had just said goodbye to my husband, David. For 25 years, he had been my companion, my anchor, the man who built dreams with me in the quiet suburbs of Boston. And now, all that was left of him was the stillness of a hospital bed, the flat tone of a monitor that no longer held hope, and the hollow ache that expanded inside me with every breath I took. As I walked out of the dim hospital room, my legs felt unsteady, as though they no longer remembered how to carry me through life without him by my side. My hand trailed along the wall, the cool paint grounding me, reminding me that the world outside of grief still existed. The halls smelled of antiseptic and faint coffee, yet underneath it all lingered something I couldn't shake, the finality of death. I had thought I would be prepared for this moment. After all, David had been sick for months, his health unraveling with each passing day. But no amount of preparation could have softened the reality of watching the man I loved fade away. When the glass doors of the hospital slid open and I stepped into the night, the cold New York air struck my face. The city was alive as ever. Yellow cabs rushed down the avenue, headlights cutting through the dark, horns blaring impatiently, people laughing as they hurried across the sidewalks with shopping bags and coffees in hand. The world was still moving, indifferent to the fact that my own had just collapsed. It felt cruel, almost mocking, that life outside did not pause to mourn with me. Tears blurred my vision, spilling hot and heavy down my cheeks, and I clutched my purse close to my chest as if it could shield me from the loneliness pressing in. Inside, I had only a few $100s in cash, though I knew the hospital bills waiting for me would swallow far more than that. Over $20,000 was owed, and now I bore the burden of facing it alone. I stood still for a moment just outside the hospital doors, inhaling the sharp scent of exhaust and cold air, trying to steady myself before calling a cab home. That's when I heard them. Two nurses in pale blue scrubs stood a few feet away near the smoking area, their voices hushed but not nearly hushed enough. "She doesn't even know the truth about her husband," one whispered, her words riding on the frosty air. The other shifted uncomfortably, glancing around before leaning closer. "The other woman in Europe and the money he kept hidden. Can you imagine?" At first, I thought I had misheard them. My mind, fogged by grief, must have twisted their words into something more dramatic than what they'd meant. But the way the second nurse's voice dropped, almost conspiratorial, told me otherwise. My breath caught, my tears drying instantly as my body stiffened. My husband? Another woman? Money hidden away? I froze in place, my heart hammering against my ribs as though demanding answers. They weren't speaking about some stranger. They were talking about David, my David, the man whose hand I had held as he slipped from this world only an hour ago. The nurses must have sensed the weight of their words, because one quickly hushed the other, and they both disappeared back into the warmth of the building, leaving me standing in the cold night with my grief now sharpened into disbelief. I wanted to dismiss it as nonsense. Surely, they were mistaken. Maybe they had confused David with another patient. Hospitals saw hundreds of people every day, names overlapped, lives tangled. But deep down, I knew better. The way the nurse had spoken, the certainty in her tone, told me this was no mix-up. As I stood there, motionless, the memories began to flicker through my mind, small things I had brushed aside over the years. The late-night phone calls David always dismissed as work. The unexpected business trips to Europe that had stretched longer than scheduled. The careful way he avoided answering certain questions, his charming smile masking whatever truth he kept buried. I had chosen trust, chosen to believe in the man I had vowed to spend my life with. But now, as the fragments pieced themselves together, I felt a cold realization seep in. Maybe I had only ever known half of him. The tears returned, but they were different this time. Hot with anger, bitter with betrayal. My grief twisted into something sharper, a wound that cut deeper than loss. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle a sob, but the sound still broke through, swallowed by the noise of the city. I turned and began walking down the street, no longer able to stand still. My heels clicked against the pavement as I moved without direction, my mind spinning. How could he do this? How could David leave me not only with sorrow, but also with secrets? Had I been nothing more than a chapter in his story, while another woman in Europe held pages I was never meant to read? And what about the money? Where had it gone? Why had he hidden it? The thought that he had left me drowning in debt while secretly holding wealth somewhere else made my chest burn. Had he intended for me to find it? Or had he hoped I would never know? I stopped at the edge of a crosswalk, staring blankly at the glowing red light. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass of a store window across the street. The woman staring back at me looked broken, pale, tear-streaked, older than her years. Yet beneath the grief, I saw a spark in her eyes, something ignited by the words I had overheard. A painful truth was unraveling, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. The light turned green, and I crossed with the crowd, moving forward not just across the street, but into the unknown path that now lay before me. I didn't know where to begin or how deep the secrets ran, but I knew this. David had left me more than memories. He had left me a puzzle, one that I now felt compelled to solve. The night air chilled my skin, and I pulled my coat tighter, whispering under my breath, "Why, David?" My words vanished into the noise of New York, unheard by anyone but me. Still, saying them out loud made them real. I was no longer just a widow mourning her husband. I was a woman standing at the threshold of a truth that could change everything I thought I knew about my life. And as I hailed a cab and slid into the back seat, one thought echoed louder than the grief, louder than the betrayal, louder than the noise of the city. I will find out the truth. When I returned to our house in Boston, the night felt heavier than ever. The taxi dropped me off at the curb, and as I stepped out, I stared at the home that had once been the heart of our life together. It was a 2-story house painted pale yellow, with white shutters that always gleamed in the summer sun, and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. David and I had spent countless evenings there, drinking sweet tea, laughing with neighbors, and planning futures that now felt like illusions. The house looked unchanged, but I had changed. Walking up those steps without him by my side felt wrong. The porch light flickered slightly, casting long shadows that made the place seem more like a memory than a home. Unlocking the door, I pushed it open and was greeted by silence. Usually, David's presence filled the space, his footsteps echoing through the hall, his voice calling from the study, the smell of his coffee in the morning, but now it was just me, and the emptiness roared louder than any sound. I placed my purse on the hallway table and stood still for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. Every corner of this house was heavy with ghosts of the past. The living room was filled with the furniture we had bought together when we were first married. Sofas worn but familiar, curtains I had chosen, picture frames on the mantel showing vacations and family dinners. Each photograph mocked me with smiles that seemed more fragile now that I knew they had been built on secrets. I moved slowly through the rooms, almost as if I were trespassing. The dining room table was still set with a vase of wilting flowers from last week. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, though no meal had been cooked here in days. My footsteps carried me upstairs, past the closed doors of the bedrooms, until I reached the study at the end of the hall. David's study had always been his private world. Dark wood shelves lined the walls, stuffed with books, binders, and old magazines. The mahogany desk, polished to a shine, sat under the window that overlooked the backyard. On the desk lay neat stacks of papers, a few pens, and the leather chair he loved to sit in. The smell of his cologne lingered faintly here, almost as if he had just left the room and might return at any moment. But he wouldn't, and that truth pressed against me as I stepped inside. I had come here countless times before, but tonight I looked with different eyes. No longer was this simply his study. It was a place that might hold the answers to the whispers I had overheard outside the hospital. My fingers trembled as I pulled open the drawers, one after another. There were folders labeled with bills, tax forms, and business contracts. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance. Then, while flipping through a stack of envelopes, I noticed a photograph tucked neatly in between. It was a picture of the two of us taken years ago, during a trip to Cape Cod. My hair was windblown, his arm draped casually around my shoulders. On the surface, it was a picture of love and togetherness. But something about it made me pause. I turned the photo over. Taped to the back, hidden carefully, was a small brass key. My heart skipped a beat. Alongside the key were 3 words written in David's unmistakable handwriting: London Safe Box. For a moment, I could not breathe. My knees felt weak, and I had to grip the desk to steady myself. What did this mean? Why would David keep a safe box in London, across the ocean, without ever mentioning it to me? What could be inside it that he wanted hidden so badly he taped the key behind an old photo? The betrayal cut deeper than before. It wasn't just the nurse's whispers anymore. Now I held physical proof in my hand. Proof that David had lived another life, kept another secret, one that stretched across the Atlantic. My marriage, our years together, suddenly felt like a puzzle missing half its pieces. I sank into the leather chair, staring at the key in my palm. Memories of his trips to Europe came flooding back. He had often said they were for business, meetings, negotiations, conferences. He always returned with little souvenirs for me: a scarf from Paris, a box of chocolates from Belgium, a necklace from London. I had cherished those gifts, believing they were tokens of love. Now I wondered if they were offerings of guilt. My thoughts spiraled. Was there really another woman? Was she in London? Or somewhere else in Europe? And the money, was this where it had gone? Was the safe box filled with cash he had hidden from me, or letters he had written to someone else? I pressed the photo to my chest, my heart pounding with anger and grief. The house around me seemed to close in, each wall whispering questions I couldn't answer. After a long silence, I stood and began searching more thoroughly. I opened file cabinets, flipped through binders, checked behind books on the shelves. But nothing else revealed itself. The study was meticulously organized, almost as if David had made sure nothing incriminating could be easily found. The key was the only clue he had left behind. I carried it with me into the bedroom. Our bed was neatly made, his pillow still indented slightly from where he had rested during his last nights at home before the hospital stay. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, clutching the key tightly. Tears slid down my cheeks again, but this time they carried not only sadness, but also fury. Why hadn't he trusted me enough to tell me? Why had he chosen lies over honesty? If he had come to me, if he had explained, even confessed, I might have forgiven him. But now, forgiveness seemed impossible. Still, one truth grew clearer in my mind. I had to know. I couldn't live the rest of my life haunted by whispers and hidden keys. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in the quiet house, the wind rattling against the windows, shadows shifting across the ceiling. My mind replayed every word I had overheard, every moment of doubt, every smile that now seemed tinged with deceit. The key rested on the nightstand beside me, glinting faintly in the dark like a tiny beacon pointing me toward answers. By dawn, I had made my decision. I would go to London. I would open the safe box. And I would uncover whatever truth my husband had tried to hide. But as the morning light crept into the room, illuminating the pale yellow walls of the house we had once built with love, I realized something else. This journey would not just be about David's secrets. It would also be about me, about reclaiming my life from the lies and finding out who I was without him. For the first time since his death, I felt something stir inside me. Not hope, not yet, but determination. And as I rose from the bed, the key pressed firmly in my hand, I whispered into the quiet, "I will find the truth, David, no matter what it costs." 2 weeks later, I found myself seated on a flight bound for London, staring out the oval window at the blanket of clouds below. The drone of the engines was steady, but my heart thudded unevenly, racing at the thought of what I was about to do. I had packed lightly, a small suitcase, my passport, and the brass key David had left behind, now hanging on a chain around my neck. It had become both a burden and a beacon, pulling me toward a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Money had been tight. Between the funeral costs and hospital bills, I had drained most of our savings. Still, I managed to scrape together $4,000 for this trip, enough to cover the flight, a modest hotel, and perhaps the unknown expenses that awaited me in a city I had never visited without David. Boston had been my home, America my world. Europe had always felt distant, the place of his business trips and souvenirs, but never part of my reality. Now, I was crossing the ocean not as a tourist, but as a woman chasing shadows. When the plane touched down at Heathrow, the London sky was heavy and gray, clouds sagging low as though mirroring my mood. The chill in the air seeped into my coat as I stepped outside, dragging my suitcase behind me. The traffic moved in unfamiliar patterns, cars driving on the opposite side of the road, buses painted bright red against the muted streets. I hailed a cab, the driver's accent thick as he asked for my destination. I gave him the address of a modest hotel I had booked near Paddington, and as we drove through the city, I pressed my forehead to the glass, watching London unfold before me, grand stone buildings, iron gates, narrow alleys, and bustling pedestrians. That evening, alone in my small hotel room, I placed the key on the bedside table and sat staring at it. My nerves were a tangled knot. Tomorrow I would go to the bank. Tomorrow I would open whatever secret David had hidden from me. The thought kept me awake long into the night, the ticking of the clock amplifying the questions spinning in my head. Who was he, truly? And who was I, now that I knew the man I had loved carried a life beyond me? The next morning, I walked through the drizzle to the bank address listed on the note David had left. The building was tall and imposing, with marble columns at its entrance and brass doors polished to a shine. My hands were clammy as I pushed them open, the air inside warm and smelling faintly of leather and old paper. At the reception desk, I introduced myself and explained that I had come to access a private safe box left in my husband's name. The receptionist, a kind man with glasses perched low on his nose, checked the records, then nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his tone professional but gentle. "We do have a safe deposit box registered under David Whitaker. You'll need to meet with one of our bankers to access it." A few minutes later, I was led into a quiet office by a man named Thomas. He was in his 50s, dressed in a dark suit with a tie knotted neatly at his throat. His voice was calm, reassuring, as though he had guided many clients through difficult moments before. "I'll take you down to the vault," he explained. "Do you have the key with you?" I touched the chain around my neck and nodded. My throat felt too dry to speak. The elevator ride to the vault was silent, the air thick with tension. When we arrived, Thomas guided me to a long row of steel boxes embedded into the wall. He stopped in front of one marked with my husband's name and gestured toward the keyhole. My hands shook as I slipped the key inside. It fit perfectly. The click of the lock releasing echoed in my ears. Thomas stepped back respectfully. "Take your time, Mrs. Whitaker. I'll wait outside." With trembling hands, I slid open the drawer and pulled out a small, heavy box. Setting it on the table, I lifted the lid. My breath caught. Inside was a thick envelope stuffed with cash, both pounds and dollars. My fingers fumbled as I pulled it open, revealing neat stacks of bills. Quickly, I estimated there must have been nearly £50,000, maybe more. For a moment, all I could do was stare, my chest tightening. Here I was, drowning in medical debt back in Boston, and David had kept this fortune hidden across an ocean. But the money wasn't the only thing inside. Beneath the envelope lay another stack, letters bound together with a red ribbon. My pulse quickened as I lifted them. The paper was yellowed slightly, but the handwriting was fresh enough, undeniably David's. The letters were addressed to a woman named Claire in Paris. My knees weakened, and I nearly sank into the chair. I untied the ribbon and opened the first letter, my eyes scanning the words. The sentences were filled with warmth, affection, and longing. He wrote about missing her smile, about wishing they could build a life together, about promises he intended to keep once his responsibilities in America were resolved. Each letter pierced deeper than the last.
Claire, Paris, love.
Promises. I felt my heart crumble with every page. It was no longer speculation, no longer whispered gossip overheard in a hospital courtyard. This was the truth, laid bare in David's own words. He had lived a life in America with me, and another in Europe with her. I had been wife and stranger to the same man. Tears blurred the ink as I held the letters in shaking hands. My mind reeled. Images of David's trips, his excuses, his souvenirs. Suddenly, they all seemed like tokens from another life, another love. I pressed the papers against my chest, a sob breaking loose despite the silence of the vault. For several minutes, I could not move. The weight of betrayal crushed me, mingling with grief until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. He had left me with debt, with questions, with lies, and yet here was proof of his devotion to someone else, a devotion he had never shown in the same way to me. Finally, I gathered the envelope and letters, slipping them back into the box. My hands trembled as I closed it, locked it, and handed the key back to Thomas, who returned without asking questions.
Perhaps he knew better than to pry.
As I walked back through the gray London streets, the drizzle soaking into my coat, I felt hollow, like a shell of the woman I had been. Yet beneath the hollowness burned something else, an ember of determination. The truth was not complete yet. The letters were only half the story. Claire was still out there, in Paris, holding pieces of David that I had never known. And I knew, with every step I took, that I would not rest until I looked her in the eyes. When I returned to America, I felt both heavier and lighter at the same time. My suitcase was packed with the envelope of cash and David's letters to Claire, yet my heart carried far more than paper. It carried betrayal, grief, questions with no answers, and, strangely, an ember of freedom. As the plane descended toward Boston, I stared out the window at the familiar coastline, the Atlantic waves glinting under the afternoon sun, and I knew life would never again be the same. The house greeted me with silence. Unlocking the front door, I stepped inside, my shoes echoing against the hardwood floor. The same yellow walls surrounded me, the same photographs stared down from the mantel, but everything felt altered. The shadows seemed longer, the air heavier. I set the envelope of money on the dining table and spread the bills out in neat stacks. They looked surreal, almost obscene, enough to pay off the bills, to secure my future, to buy me time to breathe again. And yet the sight of them filled me not with comfort, but with bitterness. This was money David had hidden from me, money he had reserved for a woman across the ocean. I sat down at the table and pressed my palms against the wood. My mind churned. I could keep the house.
I could pay off the debts.
I could even pretend none of it had ever happened, shut the box of letters and bury the truth alongside David's grave. But the idea of living in these rooms, surrounded by memories that now felt poisoned, was unbearable. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a mausoleum of lies. One evening, unable to contain the ache any longer, I walked into the living room and stood in the spot where David and I had once decorated Christmas trees and celebrated birthdays. The shadows stretched across the carpet, and I spoke into the emptiness, as though he were still there. "You broke me, David," I whispered, my voice trembling but firm. "But you also set me free." The words shocked me. They rose unbidden, yet as they left my lips, I realized they were true. His betrayal had torn me apart, yes, but it had also released me from the illusion I had lived under for years. For the first time in decades, I was standing alone, not as his wife, not as half of a couple, but as myself. And though that thought frightened me, it also stirred something inside me that I had not felt in years. Possibility. Within weeks, I put the house on the market. Packing my belongings was painful, sorting through closets filled with shared memories, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Some things I carried with me: my mother's silver locket, the quilt my grandmother had sewn, a box of journals I had kept since I was a girl. Other things I donated or sold. The furniture, the dishes, even David's books, I released them one by one, shedding the weight of a life I no longer wanted to inhabit. The day the realtor placed a sold sign in the front yard, I stood on the porch one last time. The pale yellow walls gleamed in the sun, the shutters crisp and white, the porch wide and inviting. Yet the house no longer belonged to me, not in my heart. I whispered a quiet goodbye and turned my back, walking toward the future with my suitcase in hand. I chose Charleston, South Carolina, almost on a whim. I had visited once, years ago, and had fallen in love with its cobblestone streets, its moss-draped oaks, and the way the ocean air carried both salt and promise. With part of the money from the safe box, I bought a small cottage near the water for $120,000. It wasn't grand, just 2 bedrooms, a front porch with peeling paint, and a garden overrun with weeds, but it was mine. Every nail, every window, every floorboard belonged to me, not to David, not to his lies. The first night in the cottage, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the tide roll in. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of magnolia. For the first time in months, I felt stillness seep into my bones. I was alone, yes, but the solitude was different here. It wasn't suffocating. It was liberating. In the days that followed, I began to carve a new rhythm. I painted the walls soft shades of cream and blue. I pulled weeds from the garden and planted roses. I walked along the shoreline in the mornings, letting the waves wash over my feet, the salt water stinging but also cleansing. Each step felt like a small reclaiming of myself, a way of saying, I am still here. But the greatest healing came when I began to write. One evening, I opened my old journals and placed them on the wooden desk by the window. With pen in hand, I started telling my story, not just the story of betrayal, but the story of survival. The words poured out, raw and unpolished at first, but soon they flowed like a river. I wrote about the night at the hospital, about the nurse's whispers, about the house in Boston, and the key taped to the photograph. I wrote about London, the safe box, the money, the letters to Claire. And finally, I wrote about Charleston, about the little cottage, and the way the ocean whispered of second chances. Writing gave me power. It allowed me to take ownership of what had happened, to shape it into something more than pain. Each page reminded me that while David's choices had broken me, my response, my decision to rise, to move forward, to build again, was mine alone. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I still thought of Claire. I wondered if she had known about me, if she had loved him with the same devotion I once did. I wondered if she, too, sat somewhere with a heart cracked open by his absence. But those thoughts no longer consumed me. Claire was part of his story, not mine. My story was here in America, on this porch by the sea. Months passed, and slowly, the ache in my chest began to soften. The grief remained. It always would, but it no longer defined me. Neighbors waved as I passed them on morning walks. I planted herbs in the garden, their green shoots promising growth. I filled the cottage with light, with books, with music that carried me through long evenings. And now, as I sit here writing these words, I realize something I could not see before. Endings are also beginnings. David's death, his lies, the shattering of my marriage, they were endings. But selling the house, moving to Charleston, buying the cottage, writing my story, these are beginnings. And they're mine alone. So I tell my story to you now, not for pity, not for judgment, but for truth. I want you to know that even after the heaviest goodbyes, even after betrayal that feels unbearable, there is still a way forward. America has given me that, the chance to start again, to stand on my own, to breathe in the salt air of a new life. David broke me, but in breaking me, he forced me to find myself. And in that I have finally found freedom.